so I can get it recorded. So here we are in the second part of this. I'm going to do a quick rehash of what we did last week. And as always, when you get off one of these recordings, you keep thinking, there's something I forgot to say. And one of the things I forgot to say when we talked about history is let's be careful throughout this course that we don't read history backwards. And when I say when we're reading history backwards, is that often, you know, people say, well, the Battle of Yorktown was the turning point. Well, they didn't know that, right? They never knew that was the turning point. The Battle of Gettysburg was the turning point. Nobody knew that. And so, or the South had no chance to win the Civil War. Well, certainly they believed they had a chance. And reading it backwards, knowing what we know now, and trying to place it within that context is a mistake. So try not to read history backwards. Remember what they're thinking at the time, and it's completely different of what we're thinking today because we know the ending. They don't. So I'm going to do a share screen here. How did I not get my Virginia one on my share screen? Well, we had talked about the starting of Virginia, and we got the Jamestown colony focused and set in. And one of the things we talked about with Jamestown is that there are going to be three types of colonies, right? There's a colony which we call a joint stock, and that's a colony which is funded by capitalist investors looking for spices, gold, whatever, to make a profit. And I think I mentioned earlier that today when you talk about venture capitalism is short for adventure capitalism that came out of this time period. And people would invest a lot of money. Heck, people invested money in pirates. Now, like Sir Francis Drake, I should point out that there's a private and a privateer. A privateer, I gotta let Lori in real quick. A pirate's an independent contractor. The pirate's out for himself, that's it. A privateer is a pirate that's hired by the government. And I know, if I know Anthony, he probably could say something about pirates hired by the government. But you could argue that's the IRS, I guess, maybe. But that's a joint stock colony where they expect some investment. And then the other one I talked about was a proprietary colony. This is one that's owned by an individual. And we gave that example as the Lord Baltimore, that they get this huge land grant. And then we'll see the same thing with Georgia. Georgia is going to be a proprietary colony, and the Carolinas, and we're going to talk about those tonight, are proprietary colonies. Well, when a proprietary colony or a joint stock colony failed, then they reverted back to the king, and then they became what we call a royal colony. And so those will be the three types of colonies we're going to talk about. Now, as I said, I'm going to share the screen here. We had talked about Virginia, and then we got into Massachusetts, and we talked about, as we can see here, the Plymouth Colony founded by Pilgrims. Pilgrims were separatists. They did not want to be part of the British government. They didn't want to be part of the Anglican Church, as opposed to the Puritans, which are going to settle this Massachusetts area, which are going to be people who want to purify the church. The last thing they liked was any of those Catholic remnants in the church. They didn't want to have any symbols, and as we've said before, they didn't like the idea. If they were to come back today, these Puritans came back today and saw churches today, they would be offended. I mean, I gave example of Lori's church, because you get stained glass windows. They say, oh my gosh, that's popery, not potpourri, but potpourri, smacks of papal influences, and they probably would have burned you all at the stake, sadly but true, because the Puritans didn't like any dissent to their rule, right? They didn't come here for freedom of religion. They came here to establish a Puritan commonwealth, and woe be to those, yes, I said woe be to those that did not believe as they did, especially Catholics. If you're a Catholic in Puritan land, look out. If you're a Baptist in Puritan land, look out. If you're a Jew in Puritan land, look out. So usually when they had dissenters, they usually banished them. One of them we talked about was this guy, Roger Williams, who established the colony of Rhode Island. It's going to be the first colony to really advocate for religious freedom for everybody. Wow, that was a shocking thing to do. Roger Williams also tended to get along with the natives better than most people did. He paid for what he got. He didn't take more than he needed. And established the colony of Rhode Island, which is now a state, which is smaller than Fort Worth, Texas in terms of population. So it's a tiny little state. And if you ever get a chance to go to Rhode Island, right up here in Pawtucket, right off I-95, you can go and see the first ever factory in the United States at Slater's Mill on the Blackstone River, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, here's where I sort of left off. I did not talk about Connecticut, New Hampshire, and when you look at Maine on this map, Maine is considered part of Massachusetts at the time. All I'm going to say about Connecticut and New Hampshire was these were areas also founded by Puritans looking for better access to the fur trade. And I don't know how well you can see on this map right here, but there's a river right up through here. And that's where a lot of these Puritans would settle, so that way they could get access to the fur trade and then be able to use the river to send it on out. They formed these colonies primarily as a protection against Indian attack. And this would happen often. You'd see Indian attack. It's interesting, there's a book, and it's an interesting book. It's called The Unredeemed Captive by John Demos. And it's along the French book, The Return of Martin Guerre. And these are controversial books because these historians sort of put the thoughts of these people in their heads. And so we really don't know that, but they do it. Well, you can understand the concern about attacks by Indians. If you were working too close to the wood line, for example, you're clearing land out of for your farm, and you had a whole family out there, and you would turn around and somebody would be gone. Because the natives could come in here quickly, grab you, and take you away. In fact, there's a raid on a place called Deerfield, Massachusetts, where they come in and take almost everybody away. Now, they do find some bodies along the way. They've been hatcheted to death. But these were people that were either infants because they didn't want to have to drag them along, or the people who could not keep up. And what they did with these people was they took them to the French in French Canada. And then they would ransom them back. And the Puritans looked at this, and this goes back to that Puritan dilemma, as we talked about earlier, as that, were you going to be redeemed? And this is the name of that book, The Unredeemed Captive. Were you going to be sent back? If you were sent back, that was clear that for some reason that God was on your side. If you were unredeemed and you never came back, then clearly somewhere along the way, you had sinned against the Lord, and this was your punishment. Now, the Puritans weren't people you wanted to mess around with. The Puritans get involved in a war with the Pequots, and for those of you who've heard the word Pequot, does anybody know the Pequot off the top of your head?
Mm-mm.
It is the name of the ship from Moby Dick, the Pequot. And they got involved with the Pequot War, and they literally wiped out a Pequot village, men, women, and children. The Puritans had Native American allies, and the Native American allies were shocked by the brutality of the Puritans, because the Puritans saw this as a battle of good versus evil. So these other New England colonies, and this is an area we're going to call the New England colonies in a future lecture, probably the next time we meet, is going to be Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. They're going to be different than the other colonies. And you can see here, just from this map, where are they making their money? They're going to be making their money in whaling, shipping like cod and halibut just for the halibut. That's a terrible joke, I'm sorry. Timber to make ships, all these things, and we'll come back to that. Last time we also briefly touched on Maryland. Maryland, founded by George Calvert, the first Lord of Baltimore, although he had died, and his son, the second Lord of Baltimore, took it over. And they had started a refuge for English Catholics, right? Again, it's because people are coming to the New World to practice their version of religion in their area. And so these are going to be persecuted people who want to find an escape, or they're people that are looking for money, or they're going to be people that are criminals and had to escape. And so, as I said earlier, there's this big rush early on to get to this new world. And we talked about this great migration in Massachusetts, where all these people flood into Massachusetts and Boston becomes the capital. But in the 1640s, that slows down. Why aren't people coming anymore? Well, it's partly because of this guy, Oliver Cromwell. England gets involved in a civil war between Charles I, who had taken over from James I after he had died in 1625. And it was an issue over, and get this, see if this sounds familiar, taxes and religion. These things just don't go away in American politics. Whether the Parliament was going to be supreme or the king was going to be the supreme. And of course, the king felt that he had divine right and could tax as anytime he wanted to. The Parliament said, no, you need to go to us. And they get into a war between the two sides. And I found this little ditty. I thought that was funny. The glorious noble cavalier master race and the Roundhead peasants. The Cavaliers, not led by King James LeBron, but led by Charles I, and the Roundheads, led by Oliver Cromwell. Well, I'm gonna make this a short story. Parliament wins. They try to make peace with the king. Then they find out he's making a deal with France and Ireland. And so they finally decided to chop off the king's head. That's a big deal, right? I mean, you don't, go ahead, history people here. Think about European kings who've had their heads chopped off. Let's name them. Okay, Charles I, Mary Queen of Scots, King Louis. Yep, There we go, right? Because chopping off a king's head was a big deal. So the king's dead, and he's not coming back headless, obviously. And Oliver Cromwell will rule England as what they call the Lord Protectorate. Now, he's a Puritan, which means that now these Puritans who were coming to the New World, they're not coming because they think things are going to be better with the Puritans in charge. Well, Cromwell will rule to about 1657, and people just did not like living under Puritan rule, right? There was no plays on Sunday. You could be arrested for dancing. You know, it was not a good place to be. But Cromwell dies in 1657, and his son takes over, Oliver Cromwell II, and nobody likes him. And so they restore, the nobility restores the monarchy by bringing back Charles' son, Charles II. They bring him back to France. And Charles II, he wants revenge. Revenge, I tells you. He wants revenge against Oliver Cromwell. But the problem is, where's Cromwell? He's dead. So what can you do to him? Well, you can do something to him. He digs up Cromwell's body after 3 years, brings him to Traitor's Hill, chops off his head in public, puts his head on a pike, and then takes Cromwell's long decomposing body and drags it through the streets of London for 3 days. That guy's got issues, clearly, and did not want to let Cromwell get away with it. So that had slowed things down. So Charles II's in charge. Charles in charge? Oh, that sounds like a TV show. And Charles wants to, reward those people that were loyal to his father, right? There were people that were still loyal to Charles I. And he goes, okay, what can I give them, right? Because I can't give them, money. They got money. All the lands are all divided up in England. He goes, oh, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you some land in the Carolinas, or this new world. And so there's about 8 of them. And their job was to start a new colony in the Carolinas. My dog is wanting out. 1 second. Okay, I'm gonna let you out, but that's it. 1 second. Okay. All right. Now, this is almost the same mistake that Maryland makes. Maryland makes the mistake this too. They say, okay, what we're gonna do here is we're gonna create a feudal society. And I know some of you know what a feudal society is that you've got this big manor house, right? And then you've got all these peasants working the land around it and paying you rent every month. And we talked about this in the last session. If you're a peasant and you come to the New World and they go, okay, you're gonna work this land, and you look around and there's all this other free land, what are you gonna do? you're going to leave. You know, you're going to go say, wait, why do I work for this guy when I can go over here and get 50 acres and be my own boss? And so that doesn't work. So what they end up doing is they adopted the head right system. If you remember, the head right system was that the idea was that if you come over here, we'll give you 50 acres of land. And for every servant you can pay, you get another 50 acres of land. And one thing about the Carolinas, they don't care who comes. This isn't like the Puritans or the Catholics. They say, look, we don't care who comes. We just need some people here because we need you to be making money, and we want to be able to tax you and have exports. And so this is going to lead to a lot of what we call ethnic pluralism. You're going to see the Scotch-Irish, the English, and I will tell you as a teaser, when we get to the Revolutionary War, this is going to be one of the nastier spots of torture and atrocities on both sides of that war. Both the Patriots and the Tories are going to engage in some really horrible atrocities. They'll introduce slaves, and slaves from the West Indies will bring in a new crop, rice, and that's going to be an early staple crop. And soon they're exporting, they have two major exports, rice and Indian slaves. Now you're going, wait, well, why Indian slaves? Well, they had tried to enslave Indians. It didn't work. One, because Indian males thought that agriculture was women's work, wouldn't do it, and they had a way to escape, right? They knew where to go. So what they did was they took these Indian slaves and they sold them to the West Indies, which means you had an ocean around you. You couldn't escape, and most of them are going to die. Eventually, we're going to end up having two Carolinas. I know, shocking, a Northern Carolina and a Southern Carolina. And eventually, they become royal colonies. So that brings us to this next state that we want to talk about. And this is going to be the middle colonies right here. And the middle colonies, when we get to this a little bit later, are going to be Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. The middle colonies are going to be founded by the Dutch. Now, the Dutch first come here when they hire an English explorer by the name of Henry Hudson to scout the area. Hudson had been hired before and had looked around, and he found this river, which he'll eventually call the Hudson River. And by the way, as for Henry Hudson, eventually he finds or discovers, if you want to call it discover, Hudson Bay. His men don't like him, so they take him and a couple of his survivors in the middle of Hudson Bay. They put him in a rowboat and say, see you later. And no one has ever heard from Henry Hudson again. So sad ending for Henry Hudson. In 1626, they buy Manhattan Island from the natives. Now, you hear this story a lot, $26 or whatever, and they go, oh my gosh, what a swindle. No, it's really a culture clash, right? Because the Dutch have this concept of private property. Native Americans don't. They were saying, you know, how can anybody own the land? That makes no sense to them. And the English were sitting there going, or the Dutch were saying, haha, we just swindled these people. They both sides think they're a little bit swindling the other side, because the Indians didn't understand that. They realized that when they started putting up walls and putting up cannons, that's what they meant by owning the land. So they buy Manhattan Island, and the Dutch will call this new area the New Netherlands. I mean, I know, they're not great at naming things, right? It's just terrible, New Netherlands. I mean, but to be fair, we had the ballpark in Arlington, not a good name. So the capital of the New Netherlands is going to be New Amsterdam. Why not? Now, the Dutch are not so interested in having this massive colonial experience over here. They're more interested in the fur trade. That's what they're going to be interested in, not so much in a huge colonization. But the Dutch get into a fight with the British. And there's a great book on this, and I think it's Nathan Philbeck. Don't hold me to that. It's called Nathaniel's Nutmeg. And one of the things that irked the British is the Dutch beat them out of the nutmeg trade. I know you're thinking, what? Who cares? Well, the nutmeg is really found in the East Indies. And at the time, nutmeg was considered the cure-all for anything. Cancer, nutmeg, right? Before there was Viagra, they said nutmeg is the way to go. If you were a priest and you felt that you had lusty feelings, guess what you're supposed to take? Nutmeg. It was the cure-all. And so if you had a box of nutmeg like this, you'd be a rich man. So nowadays, when I go through Kroger or Albertsons and I go by the nutmeg things, I go, let me have all the nutmegs. Ha ha, I'll be a rich man. But no one cares about that anymore. But the Dutch beat them out of it. And so the British decided, okay, look, we're tired of having the Dutch in New Amsterdam in our backyard. I mean, my God, they're growing tulips everywhere. They're clog dancing in wooden shoes. Next thing you know, they'll be building dikes. You can't have that with the Dutch. And so they send in the Duke of York, and he goes, we're kicking you out, Dutch. And they kick him out. And of course, with the Duke of York there, he's from York, so he's going to call this new place New York. And then, of course, the main city is going to be called, strangely enough, New York City. Come on, people. Let's show some creativity in naming things. Well, still, the Dutch influences remain. Wall Street is the original Dutch name, and you can probably guess where the name Wall Street came from. That's where the wall was that surrounded the original fort. Broadway, it was the widest street at the time. And then, of course, we have famous Dutch people of Dutch ancestry. The Roosevelts, Franklin Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. Reagan claimed to have some Dutch ancestry. Martin Van Buren, our first Dutch president, really. And then we get a lot of our fairy tales from the Dutch. Rip Van Winkle, right? Our version of Santa Claus is a Dutch version of Santa Claus. So that Dutch influence still remains. Now, right next to that, you're going to see New Jersey, which seems to be a butt of a lot of jokes nowadays. I'm not sure why. It is the Garden State. New Jersey used to have two parts to it. There was an East New Jersey founded by Dutch, disaffected Puritans, and a group of Scots. And then there was a West New Jersey founded by English Quakers. And then in 1702, they became one colony, New Jersey, led by, originally from a guy named Sir George Carteret and another guy by the name of Lord John Berkeley. So that brings us to the other interesting one here, and that's going to be Pennsylvania and then additional Delaware. Now, Pennsylvania, and I've got to shift this picture here. I didn't put it in here yet. Oh, I didn't finish because I was stuck in a meeting. Pennsylvania is going to be, somebody's wanting one more chat question. Garden State, but nothing but an industrial wasteland now. Yeah, that may be New Jersey. Good point. So when we talk about Pennsylvania is going to be founded by Quakers. Now, that's not their official name. Their official name is the Society of Friends. And I'm not talking about Rachel and Ross and I don't know the other friends from Friends, don't ask me. These were founded by George Fox in 1647. And they believed, and this is sort of interesting, in the doctrine of individual spiritual interpretation. Now, in my class normally I say, do we really need to know, or do I need to define the doctrine of individual spiritual interpretation? I don't think so. I think that pretty much says it all, right? That the individual can interpret the scripture, right? And so they had no formal sacraments, nor did they have a formal ministry. The way the Quakers would work is that people would sit around and just wait for somebody to speak. If somebody felt the urge to start talking, they would just start talking. Otherwise, you could sit for an hour and no one say a word. Sounds like a horrible date, doesn't it? They would use the thee and thou, even though that had gone out of style, really. They wouldn't take oaths. They would not swear an allegiance to the king, which, as you can imagine, is going to make them unpopular in Britain. They embraced this idea of simple living, which they still do today, and pacifism, which means that they would not involve themselves. They would not involve themselves in military affairs. They just didn't oppose it. Now, oddly enough, one of the great Revolutionary War heroes, Nathaniel Greene, is the fighting Quaker. But that made them unpopular in Britain as well. Now, they're very persecuted even as I pointed out earlier in Massachusetts, where they hanged Quakers, but they were very tolerant themselves. In fact, they got along with the natives better than anybody. They believed that and only paying for what they bought, and then not taking any more of that. They would negotiate with the natives, and they were opposed to slavery. They believed in religious freedom for everybody and equality of the sexes and full participation of women in religious functions. That's pretty amazing for that time period. Now, George Fox visits America in 1673. He takes a look and he goes, I've got an idea. We need to have a Quaker Commonwealth in the New World. That would be great. So he's not going to found it, but a guy named William Penn will in 1681. Now he's going to recruit the Quakers from England, and he's going to go, okay, well, that's some, but we could have some more. So he's going to bring sort of the Quaker cousins, if you will, the Mennonites, and probably people you're familiar with, the Amish. And then he's going to name this land Pennsylvania, which translates simply into Penn's Woods, and it's named after his father. And so Pennsylvania is going to also be a fairly diverse country with a lot of English and German. In fact, we're going to see when we get to the Revolutionary War, when Hessians are captured, they will send them to Pennsylvania and a lot of them just stay in Pennsylvania. Eventually, he thinks the Duke, William Penn thinks he needs more land, and so he gets another grant of land for the area of Delaware. And originally, Delaware was going to be part of Pennsylvania, but it had become its own colony later on. And that brings us to the last of the colonies that we want to mention. Let me see if I can change the screen here. That's what I'm looking for. And that's going to be Georgia. And it's been on my mind. Anybody? That's a terrible joke, I know. But I'm pretty sure everybody gets it here. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Isabella. I wonder if it's a rainy night in Georgia. Well, Georgia is an interesting colony. It's founded by this guy named James Oglethorpe. Now, Oglethorpe is a philanthropist. And he said, I'm going to found a colony. It's an experiment. He says that the experiment is, I'm going to champion prison reform. And he says, I'm going to find a colony for the poor. Because as you know, in Britain, they used to have this thing called debtor's prison, right? That you could go to prison for not paying your debts. Now, we don't have that in the United States. Thank God, probably cost us too much money. And so he said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start a colony, or I want to start a colony that poor people who've been in debt can come over here and start up everything new. Okay, that sounds like a good idea. But that's not going to sell to the British. They need something more. And he said, okay, I'll tell you what. This will also be a defense against Spanish Florida. So if you look at that map, they go, okay, all right, Spanish Florida, that would be good because if they ever invade, then when they first start attacking, they're just killing a bunch of poor people. And ex-cons, we're cool with that. That way we can muster forces before they get to something important, like the Carolinas. Sorry, Georgians. Well, it's going to be a mixed bag. The experiment failed because he decided that what they were going to produce was silk and wine, which, okay, that makes no sense. That makes no sense in that place. It was unsuccessful. And what they also did was they limited land holdings to under 500 acres. No rum was allowed. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do with that rum? And they did not allow the importation of slaves. But it was successful as a defense against Spanish Florida. In 1753, the colony becomes a royal colony, begins to thrive. They start exporting rice, indigo, lumber, what we call naval stores. Naval stores are used to produce ships, right? Turpentine, pitch, tar, that sort of stuff, beef and pork. So we've established the colonies, all 13 of them. That's them. Now that we've done that, let's take a little brief look at colonial way of life and talk about the people who come to America. Well, they come from all over, right? Like we said, we're going to see some Swedes, we're going to see some Dutch, some Germans, lots of British, obviously. Most who came to America were young. One half were under the age of 25. Often, you were the third son of some landowner in England, and you had no future, right? Because the way that worked was the eldest son got everything, and you're going, I got nothing. And so you would have a son that didn't have anything, and you would send him over to America, or you would had a troublesome son, and you would send him over to America, right? So, like, if my dad lived in England, he probably would have sent me to America, right? Because one, I am troublesome, and two, I'm not the oldest son. Most were male, and we're going to see this constantly. There's a shortage of women early on in the colonies, and we talked about this too. This is going to lead to a greater amount of adultery. I know, shocking. You tend to think people were much more moral back then. They weren't. But there is going to be some greater laws to protect women from abuse. Half of the people that show up here are indentured servants or slaves. We talked about what an indentured servant was, somebody that would pay your way over here. You had to work off that debt, and then you would get land yourself. But for most of those people, they died before they paid off their debt. And if you're a woman and you're an indentured servant and you gave birth, then your child became an indentured servant, because then somebody had to take care of that child. And then when that child was old enough to work, they'd have to pay off the debt they owed. Now, roughly 50,000 convicts were sent to America. I know there's a lot of jokes to be made about that in the 1700s, probably settling around any government building, as some might think. Very few people come with their families. Only about a third come with their families. Most are going to come by themselves to this new world. And very few wealthy people come here. Why would you, right? If you're super wealthy in Britain, why would you go to the New World? That was rare. You go to the New World because you were looking for some sort of economic opportunity, obviously. Now, coming across was difficult, as you can imagine. Ships were disease-ridden. A lot of people would die on the ships. You didn't drink, you didn't bathe like you do here. There was no water for bathing. You cleaned your clothes out with urine. A lot of rats, your food was maggot infested. Again, people who think it was great to live back in those times, they're idiots. It was not great to live back then. But somehow the population begins to grow. And I'm going to give you some numbers here, just for numbers' sake. In Virginia, the population from 1644 to 1674 grew from 8,000 to 32,000. By 1704, it was at 75,000. So it's growing fast. Now, for the colonies as a whole, get these numbers here. In 1700, there were 250,000 colonists here, 250,000. By 1750, there's 1 million. So you can see the population growth so quickly. And then in 1775, near the outbreak of the Revolution, 2.5 million people here. So the population was expanding incredibly fast. So why is this population expanding? Well, one of it's going to be birth and death rates. Now, early on, few women in the colonies, right? But people tended to marry a little bit younger. They weren't marrying at 13 or 12. That's not the case. We're talking about 18. They would marry. And this gave a time for 2 additional births. So we talked about this earlier, that it wasn't unusual for a woman to give birth to 13 children, 14 children. And then, of course, the number one cause of death, obviously, is childbirth. Strangely enough, the number 2 cause of death for women, burning to death, because they wore linen clothes with those big dresses near open fires in New England. And interestingly enough, in New England, over half the women were pregnant before they got married. But they did marry the person who got them pregnant. So yes, back then people knew how to have premarital sex. That's nothing new, even in Puritan America. So they also had a better life expectancy here, and for several reasons. One, the winters weren't as severe. They weren't that bad usually. Um, and there was plenty of food, right? Once they learned to plant crops and exploit the local game, famine was not something that the Americans experienced, unlike in Europe. There was lots of lumber. And of course, you need lumber. Um, you need lumber because that's what you built your house of, right? That's also what you heated your house with and cooked your food. When we get into the second half of this, we're going to talk about being in Kansas because there's no lumber in Kansas for the most part. And how do you build a house and how do you cook your food? Which probably some of you already know how you cook your food. And they were spread out along the coastline. There wasn't a lot of large, a lot of large cities here. They were spread along the coastline. Yes, Anthony, that's the correct answer. I'm not. They'll show up in the chat for those of you who want to read it later on. There weren't a lot of large cities because, as you know, you go to London, it's just Plagueville, right? You go to these large cities and you're talking about open sewers, people would get sick, and usually what happened is the yellow fever would come through some city and everybody would have to flee the city, right? That was certainly true of the kings and queens. But being spread out means that they were less exposed to disease. Now, we'll see that change when we start getting some bigger cities. Now, this is interesting. In 1790, and I picked 1790, and this is the year of the census, by the way. In 1790, we gave our first census. The average age of the average American in 1790 was 16. 16, that was the average age. Today we're into the 30s as being the average age. Now, I do want to point this out. I think I pointed out the last time was that when we talk about life expectancy at the time, you know, people say, oh, you know, you were going to die at 36. No, that's a little bit deceiving because life expectancy in 1900 was 46. That was simply because people died in their childhood from diseases, and that lowered the life expectancy. As I said before, if you could make it to 21, you were going to live to be in your 60s. But the hard part, of course, was getting to 21. That was the hard part. So let's talk about social status of women during this colonial period. All right. So now they believe women to be the weaker of the sexes, right? I mean, you're shocked by this because women are giving birth 13 times, and yet somehow they're the weaker of the sexes. They thought women were weak and feeble-minded. This was a long tradition. And they thought that the only way women could find happiness was dutifully obeying every one of their husband's wishes. I have a feeling that's the only way men found happiness, not women. And so women were not supposed to ever challenge their husband. Women could not vote in most places. They could not, in any place, they could not hold office. They could not attend public schools. They could not attend colleges. They could not sue somebody in court. And for most parts, they couldn't make contracts or own property. Shocking, right? I mean, there were examples, and actually I was at a SHEAR conference, which is the Society of Historians of the Early American Republic, and one person did their paper on women who owned inns along Baltimore's Inner Harbor, but that was the rarity. So this isn't going to be surprising as I'm sort of tipping the scales here and giving it up a little peek ahead. When we get to the anti-slavery movement, it's not surprising that women, in a lot of ways, are at the head of the anti-slavery movement, because how do women see themselves at this time? You can't vote, can't preach, can't hold office, can't go to school, can't make contracts. You have no reproductive freedom. You're at the will of your husband. Therefore, they saw themselves as slaves and identified in that anti-slavery movement. Now, since there was a shortage of women early on, it made it easier for women to seek divorce, right? And you can understand why those laws were available, because men would be able to convince women to divorce their husbands if possible. And as I pointed out earlier, if your husband died, your job wasn't to sit around and go, oh, boo-hoo, my husband's dead. Your job was to, as soon as possible, remarry and start having children again. We'll see this later on with the notorious John Brown, who fathered 20 children from 2 separate wives. His first wife died in childbirth. So that's the social status of women. So let's talk about, real quickly, comparing and contrasting the different regions of the colonies. And all I want to do tonight, because this is a fairly long, drawn out topic here, is to talk about the southern colonies tonight. And when we talk about the southern colonies, we are talking about Maryland. You don't think Maryland is a southern colony today, but it was considered it based on when it grew. Delaware, same way. Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Those are your southern colonies. And let's talk about them in terms of economics, religion, education, and just society in general. Now, the Southerners had one major advantage, and that was a climate advantage. As we all know, it's a little bit warmer in the South longer, which means that they could grow exotic crops that were prized in England. And of course, the first one of those crops is tobacco, right? And we talked about John Rolfe introducing tobacco. In 1619, they exported 20,000 pounds of tobacco, Virginia did, to England. But by 1688, it's 18 million pounds. And smoking was all the rage in Europe. By the way, still is. They smoke more than we do. Now, you'd think, well, they didn't know smoking was bad for you. Yeah, they did. King James I referred to it as that stinking weed that made people hack and cough. But as you know, that didn't stop people from smoking, nor does it do today. So it was the rage in all of Europe. And then southern woods also produce a harvest of lumber and naval stores. We talked about this. Naval stores were things that were helped to build ships: tar, pitch, turpentine. And the state that led in naval stores, okay, can anybody want to take a wild guess? What state would have led in naval stores of tar, pitch, and turpentine? I know I'd get an answer. You would think Georgia, but that's a good guess. I did bring it up. Actually, North Carolina, because what's the nickname of North Carolinians? They're the Tar Heels, and that goes back to the time period when they produced a lot of tar. The idea was that you could tell a North Carolinian because he had tar on his heels. Now, the South had very large plantations, and they had to have them because tobacco is one of those crops that burns out the soil. You use up all the material, and so they'd have to rotate when they were going to plant that crop. And you're not going to see a lot of cities develop in the South. The largest city is going to be Charleston, and its population is 12,000 people, right? It's not much bigger than Kennedale is. So it's interesting because no large cities, keep that in mind in the South, because I'm going to come back to that. Now, the plantation economy itself depended upon manual labor. And half the people that really first came here were indentured servants, right? Or they'd been convicted of crime and had to work, and they had to work off their debt to be free. And of course, most of them died. So eventually what happens in England, however, is that the economy gets pretty good, and you don't see as many indentured servants going around. So they're going to turn to another source of labor, and that's going to be slavery. Now, slavery itself had been dying off in Europe, and we'd already talked about in 1619, some of the first enslaved people arrived here. Some were treated as indentured servants, some on their own land, and slaves themselves. And so they started importing slaves. And by the mid-1700s, get this, by the mid-1700s, 20% of the country was African American. To give you a general idea of that, today 13% of the country is African American. So 20%. South Carolina, the population was 60% slave in South Carolina. So as you can imagine, South Carolinians always feared slave revolt, right? That's not shocking. And slaves would come from very diverse areas of Africa, right? Because that's what's going to happen. We're going to see them as slave traders go to Africa, and fellow Africans who were complicit in the slave trade, they would war on neighboring tribes, take those people and sell them into slavery. What better way of getting rid of your political opponents or rivals, right, than selling them into slavery across the ocean? And so they would be packed in these ships these slave ships across what they call the Middle Passage for 4 to 6 weeks. They would be chained in levels, lying down, and they'd be only allowed out once a day. They would be in their own excrement, right? Some would just jump off the ship and kill themselves. Very few revolts were possible, and many will die. 1 in 7 will die on the trip over. So you can imagine the horrors of that experience, of that slave trade. Now, this is something that we also need to know when it comes to the slave trade, that only about 2%, now get that number, 2% of the total African slave trade comes to the United States. That means the other 98%, and that's a large number, is going to the West Indies and South America and Central America. So a small percentage comes to the United States. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference between slavery in those places and slavery in the United States, because there is going to be a difference. All right, so let's say you're in South Carolina and you're a slave, and you go, okay, this sucks. I hate being a slave. It's cruel. It's horrible. Why not revolt? You outnumber whites. Well, there's several reasons. One, they'd come from diverse backgrounds, often didn't speak the same language. There was a communication problem at first. 2, they're unfamiliar with the terrain. Where were they going to go? That was a problem. 3, whites had guns. And we'll talk more about this later. When we talk about slave revolts, the first thing that most slave revolts plan on is going to the armory and getting the guns. John Brown's raid was going to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, because that's where the armory was. Nat Turner's rebellion was to go good to the armory. Denmark Vesey's rebellion, or attempted rebellion, was to seize the armory. And the other problem that you face and I point this out, this is a little bit of my French thing here, Isabella, is that the problem is, in every organization or in any occupation, you've got collaborators, right? If the United States was occupied by Martians tomorrow, would you have collaborators with the Martians? Yes. And so what would happen is, and same way was the French, right? The French had collaborators with the Nazis, right? You find collaborators in everywhere. Well, the problem is you'd say, okay, we're going to do this rebellion, but we need enough people, but we can't tell too many people, because eventually what happens is you tell one person too many, that person gets nervous, or that person thinks they can win their freedom by going and ratting out your rebellion, and then it's done for. That's why we know a lot of plots of rebellion, but eventually they're uncovered. When we get to South Carolina's Denmark Vesey rebellion, that's exactly what happened. And then, of course, the other problem with the slave rebellion is that they were going to be brutally repressed. In 1739, there was the Stono uprising in South Carolina. And what planters did was they chopped off the heads of 20 slaves and put them out in the fields on pikes as a warning to anybody else who might think about revolting. Well, this diverse group of Africans, and we'll come back to this a little bit later when we get to the antebellum period, we're going to forge a new identity as African Americans. And they're going to be very influential in American music, folklore, and religion. Especially when you look at music. Almost every form of music in the United States today traces its roots back to African American slaves. Whether that's the blues, that's rock and roll music, that's jazz, that's tracing its back to African American roots. So although we may not think bass rollers as a traditional having its roots in African American history, it does. They're going to be, their religion is going to be combined with Christianity, because a lot of them came from different religious backgrounds. And their constant theme, and we'll go more in this in a later lecture, in Christianity is the theme of redemption, right? Because they identify with Moses, right? Because Moses freed the slaves, right? Got his people out of Egypt. Now, for slave owners, they wanted them to learn some issues about religion, like servants obey your masters. They picked and choose what they wanted out of the Bible to teach them. Now, at first, slave families were discouraged. They go, no, we don't want slave families. That's bad. But then soon slave owners understood that that was a stabilizing factor, because You cannot run away or run away as easily when you have a family, right? You didn't want to leave your kids. And one of the interesting things that during the New Deal, they began an oral history project under the Works Project Administration, where they interviewed former slaves, because they were still alive in their 80s in the 1930s. And they were talking about how when the war ended, a lot of them had been traded off away from their families, and they had gone and tried to find their wives or husbands, only to find out that their wives or husband had started a new life with another wife or husband, because they didn't know if they were ever going to see that person again. And it's interesting too, there's been a lot of research on the slave family. It developed a little bit differently. There was more of equality in the slave household, right? Because men and women had to do the same work, right? They're both out in the field. They're both doing the same really hard work. And there was a really a greater knowledge of an extended family there, because you would have been together and you would know all these different uncles and cousins that you would see that you didn't see in the planter's household, right? So men and women were a little bit more equal in the slave household than you would see in the white household at the time. Now, I have a question here a second. Question, comment. The movie Harriet. Oh, on Harriet Tubman. Yeah, that is a good movie to watch. Again, more history stuff too. Now, here's the tough one for you, okay? And it's a questionable thing. Which comes first, racism or slavery? Right? Because here's a question I ask my students. I say, why don't we have slaves today? And their argument is, well, it's illegal. No. They say, well, because they won't stand for it. No. When the correct answer is, we now assume that owning other human beings, we have come to that conclusion, is morally wrong, right? That's why we don't have slaves. It's not because we passed a law, at least I hope not. I hope it's not because we think there's an amendment or whatever. It's because we have come to the conclusion that it was morally wrong. Now, did they know at the time that it was morally wrong to enslave other people? Yes, absolutely. So the question becomes if you know it's morally wrong to enslave another people, what must you do? Then you have to make it where they're not people, right? That they are some sort of separate entity, and therefore it's justified in enslaving them, right? Because, yeah, it's wrong to enslave people, but they're not really people. So it's okay to enslave them. And this is something that we see all the time. When we get into the future with Nazi Germany, how did the Nazis justify slaughtering Jews and Russians and the Romani? They do it because they say what? They're not people, right? There's something different. So do we use racism? Did we get racism from slavery? Slavery from racism? This is a debate that we talk about often in history. But that's how you have to do it. And we do know this, okay? We do know, and when people say, well, they didn't know slavery was wrong, clearly that was a topic for debate. Clearly it was. And if it was a topic of a debate, then that means there were questions on whether or not enslaving other people were wrong, right? The Quakers thought it was wrong. There were New Englanders who thought it was wrong. And so there were Southerners who may have known it was wrong. Jefferson probably knew it was wrong, and so did Washington. But economics won out for those two guys. So when we break up the who's in power in the South, that's going to be a group we call the gentry. And this particular area is going to be the Tidewater gentry. It runs from Virginia to South Carolina. These are people like Washington and Jefferson. They're going to pattern their life after English gentlemen. They want to be seen. They really want to be seen as really English lords. That's what they want more than anything else. So they're going to try to pattern their life after the English gentleman. They're going to build huge estates, right? At least make them look nice. And if you go to Mount Vernon, it looks like this big stone estate. But when you go see it itself, it's actually wood painted with a white paint with sand in it to make it look like it's stone. And so they want to have these huge estates. They want to keep up with the latest London fashion. Start checking the newspapers. They get London newspapers 6 to 8 weeks late, but they want to dress like the latest London kids. They want to send their kids to English schools. They want to learn to paint like the English. They just so want to be like the English. And they want to be seen as better than everybody else. Now, of course, for the English, they're never going to see them any better than anybody else. Because how did you become an English lord? You were born into it. If you were into money, you were just still a peasant. If you've ever watched the great miniseries Pride and Prejudice with Colin Firth, they keep making fun of Elizabeth Bennet's family because they didn't have any wealthy blood. They were from the merchant class. And that's always going to be the case. In fact, Washington and Jefferson, they're always going to have this sense of inferiority when it came to the British. And this is going to make it difficult when they have to try to revolt against them because they're not sure if they're up to it. And they're going to spend themselves into debt trying to get themselves to be English gentlemen. It's interesting because they can't win, right? Because they go, oh, look, you've got a nice carriage, but you don't have matching horses. That's what British visitors would say to them. And they go, okay, I'm gonna go get the matching horses. Got it. And they go, well, yeah, you got matching horses, but you don't have matching saddlery. Go, oh my God, I gotta get matching saddlery. It was literally keeping up with the Joneses as much as they could, and really felt inferior. But they did feel superior to their fellow colonists, right? This was at a time period where if you're walking by George Washington, you didn't look Washington in the eye, you doffed your cap, right? You bowed. That doesn't change until really the age of Jackson, where suddenly the handshake becomes the preferred method, because in the age of Jackson, the idea is, and we'll get to this in the Jackson presidency, is that everybody's equal. They're all citizens, right? That becomes a little bit different. So these Southern gentry people are going to be really wrapped up in trying to keep up with the British constantly. What about religion in the South? This is one that really throws people for a loop. You think the South today, you think really religious, right? Not so. In the South, church membership was limited to about 1 out of every 15 people. Now you're going, what? The South is very religious. No, the reason is they're all spread out. There's no major towns. People didn't you didn't have a church. What you would have is a circuit rider. That would be a minister that would come by maybe twice a year. Now, what this leads to, as you can imagine, is a lot of people getting hooked up without officially being married. So there's reports of ministers talking about all the BASTARDS. I don't say bad words, so I spelled it out. Thank you for getting that as well. You go, oh yeah, I spelled it all out. And so, because what would happen is like, you fall in love with somebody and you go, look, I want to get married, but there's no minister, but let's hook up. Let's start having babies and start running a farm. And so the minister would come by, and then you could officially get married. But until then, how you got married it was primarily a civil function. You and your wife would meet, and you'd have somebody there who'd say, I'm witnessing that they are saying they are married. So it's really sort of the beginning of a sort of a common law marriage in the South. So not a lot of religion. And even if you had a church and you were the minister, woe be, I'm using that woe be to those who might preach against what you like. If you preached against fox hunting and you preached against gambling, you were out. I'm sorry, we don't need you to be preaching against that. You can only preach against the sins that we tell you to preach against, because we are going to do these other sins and we don't want you to remind us of it. So always interesting. And they would just fire you at that point. What about education in the South? It's going to be fairly non-existent. And it's going to be non-existent by until after the Civil War, for the most part. There's not a lot of schools because people are spread out. And they're spread out. And so your job was, as a kid, was maybe they would teach you how to sign your name. Sometimes it would just be with an X. And maybe you learned how to add. But everything else was relegated to farm work. So not a lot of formal education that you'd see in the South. So to wrap this up, and this is what I'm bringing back to slavery, look at the South. No large cities, no really centralized education system, no centralized churches. So what are the institutions that unite the South? They really only have one. And that institution that unites them is what they call their peculiar institution. And that peculiar institution is slavery. That's going to be the uniting factor of the South until the Civil War. And it's interesting because if you go to places like in South America and Central America especially, you had strong Catholic churches there. And those churches would mitigate some of the crueler aspects of slavery. In fact, you could actually get your children out of slavery. But there are no such institutions in the South. There's just slavery and their economics. All right, that's an hour worth of talking. I'm a little tired. I don't know about you guys, but I was all excited about that. And yeah, Anthony says I'm wrong about Southern churches. Not really, not in the early colonial period. They're just not there, Anthony. They pop up a little bit later. But people are very spread out in the Carolinas, out in the wilderness. But they'll eventually pop up. But anyway, the next time at our next meeting, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about New England. So we'll be talking about economics in New England. We're going to be talking about the triangle trade. We're going to get mercantilism. We're going to talk about religion and the Puritans. We are going to talk about the Salem witch trials. I know you're saying witch trials, the Salem witch trials. That's a little witch joke there for you. And then we'll hit up the middle colonies. And from there, we're going to move on to talking about the Enlightenment, a very big event, as you all know, 1660, which will be exciting, which is going to break the old habit. And I talked to Anthony about this before. I said, you know, when people say, well, we've always done it that way, I go, no, that's what the Enlightenment's about. We don't do things like that anymore. And then we'll talk about the Great Awakening, which I hope to have early in the morning at some point, which leads to a lot of different denominations in the United States. So thank you, Isabel. Thanks, Anthony. Just quit making me laugh. Anthony makes me laugh on these things. So I smile. It's because he's telling a joke. And we'll take it from there. Next week, I'm going to post this here shortly. So thanks for coming. Tell your friends to come along, and we'll get going. More history. So I'll see you guys next time.